Hello, world and universe. Welcome to the Trevor Donald Experience. Manifest your truth. And oh boy, I've been talking about this for months now. This whole migrant crisis issue in Chicago. And I've put up several videos, whether it's been on TikTok, Instagram, or my Trevor Donald Experience YouTube channel. And when I initially started putting up my concerns about all of this influx of migrants to Chicago and what the state of Illinois, the city of Chicago, and the federal government were going to do with these migrants, I got a lot of comments about how I was anti-migrant, which was silly. All I was doing was raising the level of consciousness for the American public to see what was taking place. How could I be anti-migrant when I'm descendant of migrants? My family was not originally from here. As we all know, the Native Americans were the first people here, and then America got colonized by Europe, and the slave trade took place, and that's how my descendants ended up over here. So none of us are technically Americans. We're all descendants of being a migrant. So I was never anti-migrant. But what has taken place now, as I was stating in my previous videos, is that the government, city government, state government, and federal government had no plan. And to transplant these migrants from Mexico and Venezuela, some of these very, very warm, non-English speaking climates, and individuals to Chicago, New York, Denver, was a very social, cultural, dumb idea. And now the migrants that are in Chicago want to go back to Venezuela and Mexico. They want to go back to communist Venezuela. They think that that place will be more effective and better for them than being displaced in Chicago, outside in tents, living in police stations, hospital waiting rooms, no winter clothes. They came here with the clothes on their backs and sandals, because of course, as I stated, from a climate standpoint, those places are very warm, and Chicago and New York is very, very cold at this present moment. And now the migrants are upset and they want to go back to where they came from. One of the first problems that I think the American government made a mistake with was that they should have placed them in places like Texas, Miami, Florida, California, where you have a high number of Hispanic heritage individuals that can speak their native language. They're very warm climates year-round, and from a social, cultural standpoint, it would have been very close to where they came from, food-wise, music, neighborhoods, and it would not have been such a drastic change for these migrants. But I guess the American government didn't care. There has to be some kind of secret financial backing for why the American government decided to bring 1 million migrants to America. There's definitely funding taking place for the cities and the states of Illinois, New York, California, because I don't believe that the politicians and the legislators would have been so welcoming in bringing these migrants if there was not some kind of financial backing and reward for our politicians, who we all know can be sold for $1, let alone $1 million or $200 million. They'll say yes to almost anything. But the breaking news now is out of Chicago. The migrants are upset, homeless, living outside, suffering in this cold weather. There's not appropriate housing. The kids are suffering. It is going to get very cold. Chicago's called the Windy City for a reason, right off of Michigan Lake. They displaced these people in many of these urban, dilapidated, economically poor neighborhoods. So you're putting poverty on top of poverty. Uh, when you are transplanted as an illegal migrant to another country, you need immediate emergency resources. We don't have time to pontificate and speculate on what to do with these individuals that are living outside. You already have a high number of homeless people in Chicago, New York, and all throughout America, joblessness, mental health issues, and now you're going to topple it with non-English speaking. They're not able to participate in the workforce. There's an educational barrier. There's a language barrier. And this has turned into a disaster. That's why the Trevor Donald Experience has been on top of this particular topic since day one. I was never anti-immigrant. I'm for migration as long as it makes sense and is mapped out and we have a plan for these people. America doesn't even have a plan for its own American citizens that are suffering. So, and people have been suffering here for decades. How are we going to solve an emergency, immediate problem with individuals that the American government doesn't even have a connection with? The American government should at least have a connection with its American citizens. American government doesn't have a connection with Venezuelans and Mexicans. I don't care what they say on the national media, that we have a place for everybody. America cannot solve the world's problems. And now St. Louis, which is right next to Chicago, is talking about it's going to be the next sanctuary city. And St. Louis is a smaller version of Chicago when it comes to joblessness, homelessness, opioid crisis, gun violence, gang violence. There's been a perpetual cycle of unhealthy, immoral, unethical, underbelly lifestyle of many of our young citizens that are corrupting each other in the city. There's an understaffing of police. And this big proponent of defunding the police that was taking place in St. Louis and, of course, in Chicago. St. Louis is down about 300 officers, police officers in the city, 130 in St. Louis County. That's 430 officers that are needed. Chicago's down about 800 police officers. And now St. Louis wants to bring in migrants into its urban city, dilapidated neighborhoods. St. Louis almost is a mirror image of Chicago in many ways for its unhealthiness. And that's going to turn out disastrous. And Brandon Johnson is not doing a great job at this thing. It's not just his problem, but it is making him look very, very bad and unsure of himself. And unfortunately, if we do this migrant situation in St. Louis, I think it's going to put a heavy burden on Mayor Tashara Jones. Both Brandon Johnson and Tashara are African American mayors. One's a woman in St. Louis and one is a black man in Chicago, along with the mayor in New York who's African American. And it is hard enough trying to run a city on its own without adding any extra burdens to it. So yes, the migrants in Chicago are upset, disappointed, and are ready to leave to go back home. This turned out to be worse than where they left. And one example we can give with people all the time, if you think about it, is you had a job, you leave that job thinking it was the worst thing in the world. You go to a new job thinking it's going to be great, and the new job ends up worse than the previous job you wish you could go back to. Sometimes that happens in relationships. You break up with a person, you start thinking that that was the worst relationship in the world. Then you get into a new relationship and you realize, oh boy, that previous relationship wasn't so bad now that I'm in the middle of this craziness. And I think that's what has taken place. I don't think you have to be a brain surgeon to figure out that this was going to have a lot of social, cultural issues with these migrants in these hot, warm climates. They had just the clothes on their backs, language barrier, and then you dump them into one of the coldest cities in America. It would be no different as me with an African American heritage if I got displaced in Africa, where my ancestors are originally from. The climate is different. I'm, whether they lived out in the country in a hut, I've never lived that way. There's a lot of places in Africa that are undeveloped. That would be a cultural shock for me. And I'm a descendant from Africa, but I am not fit, and from an honest standpoint, to live in Africa unless I'm living in an area in Africa that has been completely culturalized into the 22nd century with nice hotels, restaurants, and all of the amenities that America has to offer. So there are several dynamics that have taken place that don't make an ounce of freaking sense with this migrant crisis and where they dump these individuals. It's been a terrible situation, and now the migrants want to leave Chicago. And Chicago has a plethora of problems. The migrant situation is one of 25 things that's wrong with Chicago. Gun violence, carjackings that are staged now that are taking place, armed robberies. There are all kinds of 30% vacancy rate on the Magnificent Mile in downtown Chicago, one of your premier shopping places. This makes not an ounce of sense. So the migrants wanted to leave. Tell me what you think. I had to put this video up. Please hit that like and subscribe button. Let's manifest our truth in the right direction.